So today I do have the immense privilege to have here talking to or with Mark Singleton, one of the top of the most important academics in the history of yoga, of modern yoga nowadays. Thank you very much indeed, Mark, for being here with me. And it's an immense pleasure actually, and to be talking to you about, different aspects of yoga, the history of yoga, and the innovation in the world of modern yoga, in which you are a well expert. So first of all, I'd like to say a few, words about yourself. Dr. Mark Singleton, research interest in the intersection of tradition and modernity in yoga. He was research assistant to Dr. Elizabeth de Michelis at Cambridge University's Dharam Hinduja Institute of Indic Research, and went on to complete a Ph.D. at Cambridge Faculty of Divinity on the modern history of yoga, in which Dr. Singleton is a world expert and specialist. He taught undergraduate and postgraduate courses at St. John's College, Santa Fe, New Mexico. His books, his numerous books actually include, among others, Modern World, the famous Yoga Body, the Origins of Modern Postural or Posture Practice, which comes to be this so important and innovative, let's say, history of modern yoga, which we'll be speaking about it afterwards. And as well, Roots of Yoga, co-authored with James Mallison, very important book for all the people who really want to study yoga in depth, and the textual world of yoga as well. And James Mallison has also written numerous articles, book chapters, and encyclopedia entries on yoga. Mark Singleton as well has been forming part of the famous Hatha Yoga project that has not long ago finished, has lasted for 5 years with different experts like James Mallison, Jason Birch, and others, in which they have researched different texts from the 10th century onwards. So we'll be speaking about all these subjects, Mark. Once again, welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and the privilege is all mine.
I think, in my opinion, it's a good idea if you don't mind to start telling a few words about yourself, because it's very important to know the character that we are dealing with, which is yourself today. And a little bit of your story. How was it that you got involved in yoga? As far as I can know, I think you practice yourself yoga. You were living in India for some time, and also you study or took different TTCs, teacher training courses in the Bihari School of Yoga and Iyengar Yoga. So would you mind telling a few, things just to describe yourself, how you got involved in this world, and then how is it that your career just to get this PhD in Cambridge about the history of yoga?
Sure, no problem. It's kind of a long story. I suppose it's hard to know where to start. I was very interested in meditation practices from a very early age, and this mainly came through sort of Western Buddhism, if you like, the Society of Buddhists, books by various authors. And then sort of later on, I went on to because there was nobody around doing any of that. It was all sort of private research and trying to figure out it all for myself. And then later on, going to meditation classes and groups. And then I think, sort of much later on from that, finding out about yoga, which in sort of popular parlance means or meant then asana, posture practice. And I think it took a long time for me to sort of realize that those two things were part of the same whole, just because one sort of appeared in the context of Buddhism and the other appeared in other contexts, whether they were religious contexts like Hinduism, or more sort of secular contexts like church halls, yoga classes, So I started to put those pieces together, and I spent about 3 years in India initially, sort of trying to learn and traveling to various places and studying with various teachers, starting to learn Sanskrit, starting to learn Hindi. And then sometime after that went back to university, and it was sort of and met Elizabeth de Michelis, who was already studying modern yoga in particular and modern Ayurveda in an institute at Cambridge University's divinity faculty. So I started working with her as a research assistant, and then went on to do the PhD, and have continued on since then, really. And it was really what I think brought me from a kind of practical or self-directed research program, such as I've been sort of carrying out in India for those years, into sort of more formal study was questions about why and how yoga had sort of evolved into what we see in the world today, what we see in India, of course, and particularly in Indian cities, the kind of, that's very distinct from what you might see as yoga practice at the Kumbh Mela or within traditional ascetic environments. And trying to sort of piece that all together, I wanted to do that because it wasn't at all clear, and I don't think it is still very clear to many people how we got from that point, that sort of ancient past of yoga, the Upanishads, even the Yoga Sutras, to the place where we are today with this explosion of sort of interest and interest in and the practice of yoga in the world. So that's sort of a short summary, really. And after the PhD, I went on editing and researching, spending more years in India, learning the languages a little bit better, and to try and get at these more at the roots of yoga, which is, as you say, as you mentioned, the title of a book that a collection of practice texts of yoga that we put out a few years ago with James Mallison. So that's the short story. The intersection of tradition and modernity, as you read out, as one of my interests. I mean, that's still the case. I think it's on that hinge. How things become modern, how things sort of transform in the sort of globalized diffusion of yoga around the world, and how new ideas get mixed in. That's really, that's what I've been interested in all the way through.
Yeah, it sounds highly interesting. From your perspective, from your point of view, being yourself a scholar, erudite, academic, and at the same time a practitioner of yoga, gives you all the credit in the world to speak, very firmly about this topic. We can see nowadays there are millions of people practicing yoga all over the world, but when, of course, we approach the word yoga, in this case, basically, we usually speak about asanas. So being yourself an expert in the study of these innovative ways of practicing asana nowadays through, different top gurus that we can mention a few, of them later on. So for a moment, if we go back to the traditional yoga being based in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, where he mentioned asana only, like a sitting posture, only meditation posture. Or if you go to the Bhagavad Gita, or when we find for the first time, let's say, the word yoga in the Katha Upanishad, that you mentioned in your book at the beginning of it. So, of course, from that moment all the way up to nowadays, it seems to be that in these teacher training courses, of course, the study of Indian philosophy is very well received. But then comes this type of confusion about, nowadays in our society, yoga in a sense has been medicalized in such a way that the practice comes to be from the therapeutic point of view. So I'd like, if possible, you make a short survey, from this, let's say, from the Yoga Sutras that are mentioned, like the main key text about classical yoga. And then the different texts come and they do appear, and then we can talk as well about the Hatha Yoga project that you have been part of. So, in your opinion, the way that the method of yoga that is practiced nowadays with different types of Hatha Yoga, styles of models, what is your opinion to start with about this? Just to focus, just to narrow the focus only in asana, 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 and therefore other parts, other methods, other techniques of yoga, and they are, a bit apart from the main focus.
Well, let's think about asana, from the beginning of yoga history. And there's no doubt, as you say, in Patanjali, in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, the broader commentary tradition, that the postures that are named there and the postures that are described in later texts are the sitting postures, because the main sort of orientation of the Yoga Sutras and that tradition is meditation, and what you need for meditation is a stable seat. And it's sort of the same thing in the Bhagavad Gita, where they explain how to make a seat. Krishna explains how to make a seat with the kusha grass and the skins and so on. And that, of course, literally is the meaning of asana. It's a seat, it's somewhere where you sit down, and it's come by extension to mean the posture that you use when you sit down. And you need a posture that's steady and comfortable, that you can remain in for a long time. And so asana has for a very long time, I think, had this sort of sense that of a posture in which you sit in order to do other things like pranayama and meditation, principally. But even though that's sort of a stable situation, it's true to say that for the sort of the period, let's say, from the first record of yoga up to the beginning of Hatha Yoga in the beginning of the second millennium, so about 1,000 years ago. But then at that point, something changes with Hatha Yoga. You start to get a new rationale and new reasons for practicing posture, and to see other postures that aren't simple seated postures, like Kukutasana, the rooster pose, where you're in Padmasana, the lotus, and put your arms through your legs and you balance. Now that's not a comfortable and easy posture. Neither is Mayurasana, the peacock pose, which is also dates back at least to then. So you've got a sort of a new story, a new idea of why you should be practicing Hatha Yoga, which comes out of the logic of this new Hatha Yoga, which from about the 11th century up to today, through the 18th century and so on, goes on developing to become a kind of new orthodoxy of yoga practice, and which is, of course, very much focused on the body. And in that time as well, you start to see the elaboration of more postural practice, different and more kind of difficult and ornate postures coming into being.
But what was the purpose in those times of those practice like Kukutasana, Majivasana? Was it because of doing tapas in a sense? Could it go back to the Sramana, where they used to stand still for some time and raise one, let's say, arm or hanging down, in order not to get just to burn their karma, or using the body, in a different way as nowadays is used. Nowadays is using all the techniques of yoga in order to improve our health, to feel better, just to bring body and mind together in a healthy state. So in those moments you're mentioning, these medieval times, these practices, which were the purposes of practicing them? What was the attitude in the mind of these yogis and yoginis?
Yeah.
Before coming to the modern times, where the history of yoga changed the outlook.
It's a good question, and there's you mentioned the ascetic tradition of tapas, which of course literally means heating, and it means a sort of an intensive practice that one undertakes to arrive at a certain goal. If you read the Mahabharata, and other texts like that, that goal is often a boon from a deity, some kind of gift or some kind of power. And within Hatha Yoga, you have this stream. So I'm going to talk about two different streams within Hatha Yoga, which is sort of a little bit complicated. One that comes from the ascetic renouncer tradition, let's say, and which is this, informed often by tapas. And I think, as my colleague James Mallison has argued, that forms an important part of posture, because it leads into what later becomes known as asana, even though at the time, if we look back, we don't find those practices referred to as asana, but they come through as bodily practices, which have, at least on the surface, a lot of overlap with yoga asana. Now, the other stream within Hatha Yoga would be a tantric one, which further split. It gets a bit complicated here, but it further splits into two models. One that has to do with raising the kundalini, which this sort of endogenous serpent energy that resides at the base of the spine, and bringing it up through the spine to the crown of the head, for enlightenment or union with the god Shiva and so on, things like that. The other sort of substream there is the maintenance of this sublimated seminal fluid in the head, which is sort of the amrit, the nectar of immortality that is in the head, that's constantly dripping down and that leads to death. Once that has all dripped down and been sort of burned up in the stomach, your life is over. So a lot of these asanas here are either concerned with that, with preserving bindu, preserving this amrit, this substance in the head, also known as bindu, or with raising kundalini. And of course, so we've got a very different picture here than what we were talking about previously in the context of the Yoga Sutras. It's a whole other world, even though I think the Patanjala tradition expands to include that world later on. But we've got very different kinds of yoga. Yoga is not just one thing, it has these phases, and the practices mean different things according to that context of whether you're doing it for tapas, for ascetic renouncer purposes, for liberation, let's say, or whether you're doing it in the context of tantra, which might have other goals, such as power and enjoyment. So, these are some of the other pictures and the other contexts in which asana flourishes in that period. And
it comes to my mind now, being myself in India with BK Sajengar, I just had a beautiful conversation with him, and I was in front of him, I was asking him, Guruji, when we speak about Hatha Yoga and asanas, is it only a physical exercise? And that he immediately jumped and said, did you read the Hatha Pradipika? Did you read the Hatha Pradipika? what does it say? What does it say? You know, like say in the fourth chapter comes to talk about the different state of consciousness. So, for instance, if we take the example of the Hatha Pradipika, and later on the Granda Sanhita, in which there are a few asanas and then purification and tapas. But as mentioning at the beginning of the first chapter, is like a ladder, like a help for getting Raja Yoga. So in other words, is it asana here mentioned like a method, a technique in order to go beyond the body, in order to get Omani Avasta, just to get a different state of mind, as mentioned in the fourth chapter of this Hatha Pradipika?
Yeah.
Is this the the finality of it, see the end of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge amount of confusion here about the difference between, you mentioned Raja Yoga and Hatha Yoga being mentioned at the beginning of the Hatha Pradipika as a ladder to Raja Yoga. Now, here I think it's clear that, well, because the text says it later, it has a load of synonyms of Raja Yoga, and it's samadhi. It's the state at the end of your yoga practice, and in that sense, Hatha Yoga is not one preliminary. Well, it is a kind of a preliminary practice, but it doesn't lead to another kind of yoga. It is all of those practices. And as you say, if once you get to chapter 4, the fourth pada, samadhi, that treats samadhi and practices like listening to the inner sound and meditation practices, and all of that is contained within Hatha Yoga. But and I'm not sure when this starts. This might start earlier, but certainly in the beginning of this modern period, in the 19th century. With Swami Vivekananda, with the Theosophical Society, they tend to, for various reasons that I look at in my book Yoga Body, they tend to say, Hatha Yoga is purely physical. It's inferior. It's sort of, it's something that you might do if you have a cold. You might do a bit of neti, cleaning out your nostrils. And then there's the superior spiritual Raja Yoga, and they sort of make this split, which might occur. In fact, probably does occur earlier in the tradition, but which isn't reflective of what's going on in the Hatha Pradipika.
Is this idea under the influence of Swami Vivekananda? Because it seems to be that, in a sense, he didn't like just to talk about Hatha Yoga or physical exercise. Is it under his influence? Because in 1893, he basically spoke in an understandable way for Westerners about Indian philosophy, but he never, in his famous, 4 yogas, he never speaks about Hatha Yoga.
No, he
didn't consider it enough, or what?
Right. Yeah. I think it was the reasons are complex, and Swami Vivekananda certainly knew about Hatha Yoga and had undergone at least a partial training in Hatha Yoga with a guru in Bengal. But then had sort of, again, for reasons that I describe in that book, had sort of turned against it. And of course, his most famous book is Raja Yoga, where he talks about Hatha Yoga in extremely negative terms, to say that it's just gymnastics. And I think maybe he's responding here to a kind of prejudice of at the time against Hatha Yoga and against Hatha Yogins, who are often sort of outside of the society structures, who are often outside of caste. You lose caste often entering into these sampradayas, into these lineages, and who are also feared, not just then, but always, I think, as people who have a lot of power and who are sometimes malevolent as well. They can be quite dangerous people, these yogis. So there's all of that going on, and for whatever reason, possibly also trying to trying to sort of work around the prejudices of his audience, which is a late 19th century American audience for whom all of this is new and strange, and repackage yoga as something presentable to them. All of this is possibly a reason why Hatha Yoga gets characterized as this purely physical, inferior practice as opposed to Raja Yoga.
And well, they say that, of course, Hatha Yoga is Tantra Yoga in a sense. But talking about Tantrism and bringing this word to nowadays, usually people tend to take courses about Tantra or Tantrism related with sex, sexual energy. So it seems to be these two currents, the left and right hand, used to be in those times, basically the way of teaching Tantrism. I mean, using the body and then this energy. However, in other texts of yoga, they talk about celibacy in order to bring this being of this semen, this energy up there to the higher chakras. So, in your opinion, how is it taken nowadays, this Tantrism, this idea, this perverted, I should say, idea of what Tantra really means or is, or used to be?
Yeah, well, just to say before I get to that what you're talking about here, the tantric current, the tantric traditions, and the ascetic traditions, the renouncing, of this sensory world. Those are two tensions that go back all the way. They're always there. They're the two tensions, if you like, that work within yoga from back then to nowadays, and they're both present. As for modern tantra, I think is a fascinating subject, because everybody, like yoga, everybody thinks they know what it is, and obviously it has to do with sex, and it's really exciting. But beyond that, we're sort of a little bit vague about that. And of course, there is that element. There is that element within traditional tantra, but within the broader tantric traditions. Of course, there's very much more. It's very much quite a rigid system and a difficult one to get into. You've got initiations which are quite difficult. You have a lot of preliminary requirements, prerequisites that you have to do before you can do these things. It's not sort of a path of free love or anything like that. But of course, this sort of idea of the body as an instrument of liberation has sort of been taken within different contexts. And I'd say here what we're talking about in the 20th century, and possibly before, in fact, with innovators like Pierre Bernard, who was sort of famously a teacher of sort of, that quite sexualized tantra in America in the end of the 19th century. What we have is, I think, a cultural product that has been captured by the forces of commodity capitalism. It's sex for sale. In a way, I think, if you look up, say, the name of your town and tantra, well, it depends where your town is, obviously, but maybe anywhere in the United States. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about Spain, but it tends to be about that, and it's very much packaged. And I think very much part and parcel of the commodification of sex, the commodification of the body, but also plugging into this sort of idea that this yearning for something higher. That by sort of sexual practices, sexual techniques that you can learn, you can become more spiritual. You can go beyond the merely mundane. So I think, I mean, I'm not an expert in modern tantra nor ancient tantra, although I sort of look at it from the point of view of yoga. I think that's what's going on. I think that's most definitely what's going on. And just by the way, tantra isn't the same as yoga. It's not, there is yoga, there are yogas within tantra, but tantra is much broader, as they say, much sort of broader ritual framework to it than I think most people might realize.
Now, can we for a moment to your already famous book that has been acclaimed, that one of the most, interesting and important modern books about yoga, the study of yoga, the innovation of modern yoga, the history of modern yoga, in which you became a well expert. Whenever I speak to somebody in different countries and different academics and experts, I mean, they always come to mention your name, and in your book. So, can you, say something about the history of modern yoga, this innovation that it happens to be basically in Mysore, where it takes the lead, the so-called grandfather of modern yoga, like Krishnamacharya. But previously, or more or less at the same time, there was Swami Shivananda there in Rishikesh with his disciples that also spread yoga all over the world, but probably in a different way. And the beginnings of this modern and medical yoga, medicalized yoga, with Swami Kubalayananda and Yogendra. So how does this amalgamated way of physical exercise that changed the way of practicing yoga in India, that nowadays it seems to be the Pisa effect is going back, in such a strong way to be taken back by the Indian people who look at the Westerners that, in a sense, have been appropriated of something that belongs to them, because we give so much importance, the Westerners, to the practice of yoga and yogic techniques that in India they look at us like saying, hey, this belongs to us. But for a moment, if we go back to your research about this physical training in India, like gymnastics, like wrestlers, like the practice of yoga, everything in a sense comes together like an explosion of people trying to strengthen their bodies through, these different techniques that you mentioned in your important, study and in your book.
Well,
so in other words, I'm trying to say that it seems to be from more or less the beginning of the 20th century, more or less, there's a change in the outlook of the practice of yoga, where the body becomes central key, of great importance. And there comes then the different systems like with Hatha Yoga comes Astanga Vinyasa Yoga, with Iyengar Yoga, and so on and so forth. So how, in that you are a well expert, how do you approach to this modern history of yoga?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I'd say
well, it's quite clear.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the world expert thing goes, I mean, I sort of tried to give an account of one phenomenon through a sort of modern cultural history. I think there's always much more. There's always much more sort of to do. And since then, I think a lot of work has been done on sort of rounding out this. This picture, and this obviously, when I was researching this book, it was at the very beginning of what you might call modern yoga studies. Nobody really was looking at it. Joseph Alter, Elizabeth de Michelis, and a few others. So it was my contribution that I hope I've sort of developed a bit after that. The first thing is that I don't think there are any sort of watersheds in this history. There's no clean breaks. Nothing that happens, say, in 1934 in Mysore, or I don't know, the 1920s at Kaivalya Dharam, the research institute of Kubalayananda. Nothing's a complete break. Everything is always sort of mixed up with what's come before, and I think a good example of that might, well, a good example of that and an ever fascinating sort of example of all that is Krishnamacharya, who you mentioned, who was, you know, in Mysore in the 1930s, teaching this very sort of, you know, very dynamic forms of yoga. And the case that I make in the book is that this sort of these practices fit with a particular taste of the time, with a particular way of a particular concern for the body and how to move the body and how to keep the body fit, that looks like a lot of other systems that aren't necessarily what we would call yoga. So, you know, gymnastics and so on, and therapeutic gymnastics. And the point there that I've been trying to get across ever since is that doesn't mean that Krishnamacharya made it all up. It doesn't mean that it's invented. What it means is that these practices had a kind of cultural context already into which they could move and develop.
Right.
So, for example, you know, I think now I published with Jason Birch a couple of years ago a paper on the Hatha Abhyasa Paddhati, a text that we worked on in the Hatha Yoga project.
It's already published.
It's already published and it's available on the Journal of Yoga Studies.
I read the PDF. Yeah, very interesting.
So, you know, I think it's clear that Krishnamacharya is drawing on older traditions. I won't go into it much here, but you know, he's drawing on older traditions, but he's also, I think, very much aware of the zeitgeist, and his case maybe is exemplary of that kind of mixing, of what's come before and a kind of modern sensibility of you know, what's needed in this time and this place, which is of course very much how Krishnamacharya always conducted his teaching. You teach according to where you are, to the time and the place, to the constitution of the student. So and the same, I think, goes for those more sort of scientific experiments and those more explicitly physical culture inspired yogas like that of Yogendra, who had another scientific institute, the first, in fact, in the world. And it's very clear that he's drawing on all these different kinds of influences from kind of Western gymnastics, you might say. He's actually, you know, one of the few who's just very open and explicit about that. But he's also, you know, if you look at Yogendra and you read his writing, he's profoundly versed in the Indian tradition. He knows what he's talking about. He knows when he's departing from tradition as such. And he knows what he's doing. He's a conscious sort of example of a sort of conscious innovator in that respect. But at the same time, he's, you know, we have this mix, we have this dynamic mix of tradition and modernity, modern concerns. And I think to some extent that is still what we have. We have a kind of you know, as through him, through the students of Krishnamacharya, in particular B.K.S. Iyengar, Patabi Joyce, and so on, we still have that kind of mixture, that kind of dynamism. But once you might say a cultural artifact, a practice, a bodily discipline, let's say, or a discipline of body and mind, like yoga, starts to travel and create its own momentum and be read and interpreted and taught by people who have no direct knowledge of that from within the Indian tradition, then obviously things are going to start to change. Things get interpreted in different ways. And in some respects, you know, some of the chapters of the book are a study in misunderstanding, creative misunderstanding, which has led to the situation that we have today often, you know, of yoga becoming a certain kind of cultural product that looks in certain cases quite different to what it would have done, let's say, in 18th century Maharashtra or something. It's just, you know, in some ways it's really obvious. Things change as they travel and they take on new cultural meanings.
Yeah, in our culture, we can see nowadays that there are so many models of Hatha Yoga or asanas that culturally everything is changing, continuously changing, as you mentioned in your book. in your study you made about that, you did about that.
Mm.
Going for a moment back to Krishnamacharya in this Jagan Mohan Palace, where he's dealing or he's, relating himself, as I mentioned, with his gymnastics, with wrestlers. So you mentioned there is an influence in his practices. And then the famous book of the famous Yoga Korunta mentioned that you, in a sense, I think to remember, you relate to the Hatha Yoga that was found in the Mysore Palace. Is that so? Because according to his song, Vesikachar, he used to know like 3,000 asanas when he was living 7 years in Tibet with his teacher, Ramamohan Brahmachari. So, and not only that, not only that, but you see his disciples, like we got Patabi Joy's teaching in a way. BK's Iyengar teaching in a different way, Indra Devi in a different way, A.G. Mohan in a different way, Desikachar himself in a different way. So it seems to be that from the same guru, the same teacher, the same master, same trunk, so many branches, extend, spread about his teachings.
Yeah, no, he's a fascinating figure. I mean, the Yoga Korunta myth, or the legend, I should say, maybe
Mark, I did myself when I was in Mysore, even practicing Ashtanga with Patabi Joyce. I made him an interview actually with Sharat, translating it, because his English was quite broken. And I asked about the Yoga Korunta. He never answered a single word about that, So.
Yes, I mean, well, Patabi Joyce has given his story, and of course there are stories from Desikachar as well, so about that and where it is and what it could be. The reason we make the link to the to the Hatha Padati is because the author is called Kapala Koruntaka, and so that word is sort of in the name. And well, you can have a look at the article, see whether it's convincing. But the idea is that might possibly have been sort of shortened down, and that word Korunta, it's spelled and pronounced in various ways by various people, so it's quite hard to know what it is.
It seems to me, Mark, the asanas in that book you have translated with Jason Birch, I think, they are quite difficult just to practice, just to do.
They're extremely difficult. They're very, very hard. Yeah, we tried to get some advanced Ashtanga yoga practitioners to do them, and they did, but they reported back. And we made a film of this. I'm not sure at what stage the film is yet, but you can see these practices in action, and they're extremely hard. They're not like Ashtanga yoga generally. It's not a vinyasa system. I think personally that's sort of an innovation of Krishnamacharya and Patabi Joyce. That's my own feeling. It comes from somewhere. There's, it's not, they didn't invent it out of nothing. And I think I'm fairly clear about where it comes from. It comes from a gymnastic text, an Indian gymnastics text called the Vyayama Deepika, that sort of, the vinyasa type flow, you might say. But the Hatha Padati, nonetheless, it's not Ashtanga yoga, but it contains some of the same postures. And as you say, it contains some extremely difficult practices that only real, adept asana practitioners could think of doing. So yeah, it's quite an exceptional text, and might also have given a kind of scriptural permission to Krishnamacharya, who was that kind of person who would look for authority within scripture, within textual authority, like Patanjali mostly. But it might have sort of given him ideas with which to then form his own systems, that we know today as Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga. And of course, Pattabhi Jois was also changing and innovating during his teaching career. He changed certain things, and not, older students know that. They know that it didn't used to be quite like that. That sort of changed, that posture sort of got added.
It is curious because Pattabhi Jois wrote that book in the 60s, more or less, Yoga Malla.
Right.
And at the beginning of it, he only mentions, the texts like the Bhagavad Gita. He says something about Patanjali Yoga Shastra and so on and so forth, but not a single word about this Yoga Kurunta.
Yeah.
Like a mythic something there. Even I think that Krishnamacharya in some of his books, like in Yoga Makaranda, for instance, not a single word about that. So probably, I don't know if it has been made up or not.
I don't think so. I think it's complicated. This is sort of my final thought really on the thing. If you look at Yogasana Galu, the Krishnamacharya's book that came after Yoga Makaranda, it is mentioned in the bibliography, in a shorter bibliography. So it means that to me indicates probably that Krishnamacharya is talking about a text that he knew, which may well be, I think probably, almost certainly, is the Hatha Paddhati. But as I've made the case elsewhere also, that this text, this Yoga Kurunta, also provides that it's a shape-shifting text, that it is the text that Krishnamacharya refers to when he's innovating, if you will. And there's various sort of anecdotal examples of that when Krishnamacharya is innovating, or when he wants to attribute something to a text, he'll say, oh, it's from the Yoga Kurunta. So it might be both of those things. It is a text, but it also has this usefulness within Krishnamacharya's teaching.
So let's see the influence of Swami Shivananda also in the world of yoga. He has so many disciples like Swami Chidananda, Vishnudevananda, Satchidananda. Of course, there were renunciate Swamis, and they didn't approach to the teaching of yoga basically or only about asanas like BKS Iyengar did, or even Pattabhi Jois. So his influence, although it's big, most of the people consider like Tirumalai Krishnamacharya like the father of modern yoga. But in a sense, you mentioned before Swami Kuvalayananda, and you mentioned Yogendra, who were also very key figures in, in the extending this yogic modern yoga, and has come to our society that culturally has changed so much, as you mentioned before. If we go back for a moment to the 60s onwards, when there appears, let's say, Swami Vishnudevananda, Swami Satchidananda, Maharishi, Mahesh Yogi, all the great gurus, but they have disappeared completely. I mean, nowadays it's not the same as it used to be. So, this conversation, Mark, what is your opinion about yoga nowadays? I mean, all the more than 100 different systems of Hatha Yoga. You get Ishta Yoga, Ananda Yoga, Kundalini Yoga, you see Astanga Yoga, Iyengar Yoga, so many different styles of yoga. So when somebody asks you, okay, what type of yoga you practice, it comes to be the question. So what is your idea about this evolution of yoga nowadays in our societies all over the world, since millions of people are practicing, in so many countries, I should say, all over the world nowadays.
Well, I try to remain agnostic as a researcher. I just sort of try and look at trends, and it's clear, looking at the history that we're living through now in terms of yoga in the world, and also maybe, you know, going back to...
Let us say that we cultivate the body with asanas nowadays, and we cultivate the mind with mindfulness. So,
Yeah.
in a sense, I say in our modern society, this is the tendency, it seems to be.
Well, it's a split. It's a split that I think is sort of a historical accident, that yoga has been associated with posture, and meditation now is associated with mindfulness, and that, you know, it's not really a historical accident. It's a real push by sort of you know, I think of John Kabat-Zinn and his mindfulness based stress reduction. I think of in the UK, the sort of the push to have mindfulness taken within the sort of establishment mainstream. But it comes from this sort of split that I was speaking about at the beginning, between Buddhism on the one hand being, you know, about meditation and mental things, and then yoga being about physical things. But of course, I think if we went back to the 60s and that sort of great opening of the doors, really, of Indian gurus coming, well, you know, going to America and Europe and traveling the world from the sort of early to mid 60s onwards, you see something very different. You see a kind of yoga like Satchidananda or well, any of those people that you mentioned, really, or Muktananda, even with his sort of tantric teachings, the Maharishi, you know, who famously, you know, taught the Beatles. He wasn't teaching them sun salutes and things like that. But that's a wave. You know, I speak to people, I've interviewed many people who lived through that. And, you know, a lot of them say, well, yoga's just got so hard today. Why does it have to, I'm exhausted after, you know, it's sort of like we've had a wave from the 60s through the 70s, let's say, but then into the 90s and the 2000s, you start to get these much more physical practices, let's say, like Iyengar yoga, which of course had been around much longer than that, but starts to really get consolidated in the 70s into the 80s, 90s, and still is today. I think I'm go out on a limb here and say that all those bits of advice that you hear about what to do in asana, what to do in trikonasana, what to do in downward dog with your hand, you know, the way you turn your hands and your arms, that emphasis all comes from BKS Iyengar. That's his innovation. And so we sort of, you know, we entered that phase, you might say, of BKS Iyengar's influence. And then along came, I think a little bit later than that, Ashtanga yoga. And over the years, over the decades, became a sort of basis for, once again, really generalizing a lot here, became the basis for a kind of what I sometimes think of as American yoga, flow yoga, vinyasa yoga, you know, all those practices, you know, power yoga, all of that, which has become a kind of, it's sort of what people expect when they go to a yoga class. They don't expect to sit down and chant Om, right, or, you know. And so I don't know if I'm getting to the point here, but maybe there's just waves, because that sort of very, very physical yoga has its limitations, I think, you know, within, textually speaking, within practice traditions. It's you sort of get to an end point. Okay, so I can put both legs behind my head, you know, or I can bend backwards and put the soles of my feet on the top of my head, or whatever, you know, and then what, you know. So who knows, maybe yoga's evolution, if there is such a thing, maybe those changes are waves that respond to where we are as a society, as individuals, and what we need, and maybe also a recognition as we go on, sort of as learning about yoga and yoga's deeper traditions. Maybe within that, we see the potential for more. We see the potential for other things. Maybe something like that. So
finally, I want to ask you, you are writing, I think, a new book about yoga and technology. I think it seems to be your latest work. You are working on that book. Are you going to publish it? Yes. Soon, or is it finished, or is about to finish it, or you're still?
I'm still working on it. I've been working on it for too long. Yeah, I hope to finish it this year. That'd be great, and as soon as possible. Really, I just need to get it off, get it out, and that also, it's about technology, basically, and how technology permeates our lives, as we all know, and how that in turn might change the culture of yoga and how we think about yoga, these sort of intersections of the body with technology, and in particular sort of yoga products, but also new theories of the mind, let's say, based on neuroscience. New sort of practices of the body, like biohacking, and how they're being related to yoga and so on, and just how we might think of yoga in that context, whether there's a contradiction in giving over our yogic selves to technology to be enhanced, to enhance our yoga practice through mechanical means or artificial means, whether within that there's something that we might look to as good, or whether that actually so fundamentally changes the project of yoga that yoga ceases to be relevant and sort of disappears.
So this comes to be a new reason to understand how yoga evolves in such a way in our society that yes. I am quite sure is going to say much about that. So Mark, I really do appreciate a lot, to have this conversation with you, and just to be able to enrich myself and others who are going to see this video about your wisdom, about your experience, about your knowledge, about your research and investigation in this wonderful field that yoga is. Thank you very much indeed. I am on the other side very happy indeed, because in a sense you come to be, or you are my neighbor. We are living now in the same community. So I have a chance to meet soon.
I hope so too. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Madana. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, it's a pleasure.